The morning mist clung to the Afghan mountains like a gray blanket. Sarah Martinez adjusted her rifle scope for the 100th time that day, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air. She had been lying in the same position for 6 hours, watching the valley below through her Barrett M82 rifle. Her spotter, Corporal James Chen, lay beside her with his binoculars, scanning the rocky terrain for any movement. Sarah was not your typical soldier. At 26, she had already earned a reputation as one of the best snipers in the U.S. Army. Her small frame and quiet nature often fooled people into thinking she was just another support soldier. But those who knew her understood that behind her calm brown eyes was a mind that could calculate wind speed, bullet drop, and target movement faster than most computers. The mission was simple on paper but deadly in practice. Intelligence had identified a high-value target in a compound across the valley. The man they were hunting had been responsible for coordinating attacks that killed dozens of coalition soldiers. Local forces had tried to capture him 3 times, but he always slipped away. This time the job fell to Sarah and her team. Her unit had been inserted into the mountains 3 days earlier. They hiked through treacherous paths, carrying heavy equipment and enough supplies for a week. The insertion point was chosen carefully to give them a clear view of the target area while remaining hidden from enemy patrols. Every step of the journey was planned to avoid detection. The compound sat on the opposite side of the valley, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by high walls. From their position, it looked peaceful, almost like a small village. But Sarah knew better. Intelligence reports showed it was heavily guarded, with armed men positioned at strategic points. Getting close enough for a traditional assault would cost lives. Sarah's team consisted of 4 people. Besides her and Chen, there was Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, their communications specialist, and Private Lisa Park, who handled security. They worked together like a well-oiled machine, each person knowing their role perfectly. Trust was everything in their line of work. The target had been spotted entering the compound the previous evening. Since then, they had maintained constant surveillance, waiting for the perfect opportunity. Sarah had studied his patterns, his movements, even the way he walked. She knew that when the moment came, she would have only one chance. As the sun climbed higher, Sarah felt the familiar calm that came before action. Her heart rate slowed, her breathing became steady, and her world narrowed to the view through her scope. This was what she had trained for, what she was born to do. The weight of the rifle felt like an extension of her own body. Chen whispered updates about movement in the compound, guards changing positions, civilians going about their daily tasks, vehicles coming and going. Each piece of information was crucial for understanding the target's security arrangements and predicting when he might appear. The radio crackled softly as Rodriguez received updates from command. Weather conditions were favorable, with light winds and clear visibility. The mission was still green, meaning they had authorization to engage when the opportunity presented itself. Sarah acknowledged the information with a slight nod. Hours passed like minutes when you were in the zone. Sarah's body remained perfectly still, but her mind was constantly active. She calculated distances, adjusted for atmospheric conditions, and planned for different scenarios. Every detail mattered when you were preparing to take a shot that would make history. The compound below seemed quiet, but Sarah knew it was an illusion. Somewhere behind those walls was a man who had caused immense pain and suffering. Today, if everything went according to plan, his reign of terror would end. But first, she had to wait for the perfect moment, when skill, preparation, and opportunity would align. Chen tapped her shoulder gently and pointed to a figure emerging from the main building. Through her scope, Sarah could see a tall man in traditional robes walking across the courtyard. Her pulse quickened slightly, but her hands remained steady. After years of training and months of preparation, the moment she had been waiting for was finally approaching. The figure moved with confidence, clearly someone of importance in the compound. Sarah adjusted her scope's magnification and studied his features carefully. This could be their target, but she needed to be absolutely certain before taking action. One mistake could compromise the entire mission and put her team in danger. As she watched through her scope, Sarah felt the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. This shot would not only determine the success of their mission, but could potentially save countless lives in the future. The man below had orchestrated attacks that killed innocent people, and stopping him was worth the risk they were taking. The mountain air was thin and cold, making every breath deliberate and controlled. Sarah's training had prepared her for these conditions, but the physical challenges were just one part of what made this mission so difficult. The mental pressure of taking a life, even that of an enemy, was something every sniper had to confront and accept. Sarah's finger rested lightly on the trigger guard as she watched the figure through her scope. Chen was using his spotting scope to confirm the target's identity, comparing facial features with the photographs they had memorized. Every detail had to match perfectly before they could engage. The consequences of shooting the wrong person were too severe to risk. The man in the courtyard paused near a fountain, speaking with two guards. This gave Sarah a perfect opportunity to study his profile. The scar above his left eyebrow, the way he held his shoulders, the distinctive beard, everything matched their intelligence photos. Chen gave her a subtle thumbs up. This was definitely their target. Sarah began her final calculations. The distance to target was 3,200 meters, over 2 miles away. At this range, she had to account for bullet drop, wind drift, air density, and even the rotation of the Earth. Her ballistic computer provided baseline numbers, but her experience would make the final adjustments. This would be one of the longest confirmed sniper kills in military history. The .50 caliber bullet would take nearly 4 seconds to reach its target. In that time, the target could move, change position, or disappear entirely. Sarah had to predict, not just where he was, but where he would be when the bullet arrived. It was like trying to hit a moving target with a thrown stone while blindfolded. She adjusted her scope one final time, accounting for the slight crosswind that had picked up in the last few minutes. The environmental conditions were as good as they were going to get. Clear visibility, steady winds, and perfect lighting. If she was going to take this shot, now was the time. The target moved toward the center of the courtyard, walking slowly and confidently. He had no idea that death was watching him from across the valley. Sarah controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate and preparing her body for the shot. Everything she had learned in sniper school, every hour of practice, every mission she had completed, led to this moment. Chen provided final wind readings and confirmed the range one more time. Rodriguez monitored radio chatter for any signs that their position had been compromised. Park kept watch for enemy patrols that might be moving in their direction. The team worked together seamlessly, each person focused on their crucial role in the mission. Sarah's world narrowed to the view through her scope. The crosshairs settled on the target's center mass, and she began to apply pressure to the trigger. Years of training had taught her to squeeze slowly and steadily, like squeezing water from a sponge. The rifle had to fire at the natural pause, between heartbeats when her body was completely still. The mathematics of the shot ran through her mind automatically. Bullet velocity, time of flight, gravitational drop, wind deflection. All the variables that could mean the difference between success and failure. At 3,200 meters, even a small error in calculation could cause the bullet to miss by several feet. Her breathing slowed to almost nothing as she entered the final phase of the shot sequence. This was the moment every sniper trained for, that perfect balance between conscious control and instinctive action. The rifle became an extension of her body, the scope became her eyes, and the trigger became her will made manifest. The target stopped walking and turned slightly, presenting a better angle for the shot. It was as if the universe was aligning to make this moment possible. Sarah made a tiny adjustment to her aim point and continued her trigger squeeze. The pressure built gradually, imperceptibly, until the rifle was ready to fire. Time seemed to slow down as Sarah entered that special zone where everything else disappeared. There was no mountain, no cold, no danger, just her, the rifle, and the target 3,200 meters away. This was what she had trained for, what she was born to do. Every muscle in her body was perfectly controlled and positioned for maximum accuracy. Chen held his breath as he watched through his spotting scope. He could see Sarah's complete focus and knew the shot was imminent. His job now was to observe the bullet's impact and call for adjustments if a follow-up shot was needed. But at this distance, there might not be time for a second chance. The morning sun had climbed higher, creating perfect lighting conditions for the shot. Shadows were minimal, and the target stood out clearly against the light-colored walls of the compound. Visibility was excellent, with no heat shimmer or atmospheric distortion to affect the bullet's path. Sarah's finger continued its steady pressure on the trigger. She could feel the exact point where the sear would release and send the bullet on its long journey across the valley. Everything had to be perfect. Her position, her breathing, her grip, her sight picture. At this distance, perfection was the only option. The seconds stretched like hours as Sarah prepared to make history. This shot would be talked about in sniper schools for years to come. But for now, it was just another mission, another target, another day at work for one of the military's most skilled marksmen. The trigger was almost at the breaking point. The Barrett M82 erupted with a thunderous roar that echoed off the surrounding mountains. The massive .50 caliber bullet left the barrel at nearly 3,000 feet per second, beginning its long arc across the valley toward the target. Sarah absorbed the substantial recoil with practiced ease, keeping her scope trained on the target area to observe the impact. For 3.7 seconds, the bullet flew through the thin mountain air. During that time, the target continued his conversation with the guards, completely unaware that his fate was already sealed. Sarah watched through her scope, counting the seconds and mentally tracking the bullet's path through space. Chen had his spotting scope locked onto the same area, ready to call the shot's impact and effectiveness. Rodriguez monitored the radio for any change in enemy communications that might indicate they had detected the muzzle flash or sound of the shot. Park scanned the surrounding area for any signs of enemy movement toward their position. The bullet struck with devastating accuracy, hitting the target center mass exactly where Sarah had aimed. The impact was immediate and unmistakable. Through her scope, Sarah watched as the man collapsed instantly, the guards around him diving for cover in confusion. The shot had traveled 3,200 meters and found its mark with surgical precision. Chen confirmed the hit with professional calm, though Sarah could hear the amazement in his voice. At that distance, even experienced snipers would struggle to hit a man-sized target consistently. But Sarah had done more than just hit her target. She had made what would become one of the longest confirmed kills in military history. The compound below erupted into chaos as guards realized what had happened. Men ran in all directions, some taking cover behind walls while others scanned the surrounding mountains trying to locate the source of the shot. The sound of the Barrett had echoed off multiple mountain faces, making it difficult to pinpoint exactly where it had come from. Sarah immediately began preparing for a possible follow-up shot, though the target was clearly down and not moving. This was standard procedure. Maintain observation of the target area and be ready to engage additional threats if they presented themselves. But the primary mission was complete. The man who had orchestrated so many attacks would never harm another person. Rodriguez reported increased radio chatter from the compound as the guards tried to coordinate their response to the attack. Some voices were panicked, others angry, but all were confused about where the shot had come from. The extreme range had worked in the sniper team's favor, making it nearly impossible for the enemy to locate their position quickly. The success of the shot was beyond what anyone had realistically expected. Shooting accurately at 3,200 meters required perfect conditions, flawless execution, and a considerable amount of luck. Sarah had delivered all three, proving that her reputation as an exceptional marksman was well-deserved. Park reported movement on several mountain paths as enemy patrols began searching for the sniper team. This was expected. The compound's defenders would fan out in all directions trying to find whoever had taken their leader's life. But Sarah's team had planned for this possibility and had multiple escape routes prepared. The team began their extraction procedures, carefully packing their equipment and preparing to move to their first checkpoint. They had achieved their primary objective, but now they faced the dangerous task of getting out of enemy territory alive. The success of the mission would mean nothing if they were captured or killed during the escape. Sarah took one last look through her scope at the compound. Below, guards were still running around frantically, and she could see several vehicles starting up to begin the search for her team. The chaos she had created with a single shot would probably continue for hours as they tried to figure out what had happened. As they prepared to move, Chen couldn't help but express his admiration for the shot. In all his years as a spotter, he had never seen anything quite like it. The combination of distance, conditions, and precision required was something that most snipers could only dream about achieving. But for Sarah, it had been just another day at the office. The extraction would be just as dangerous as the approach had been. Enemy forces would be actively hunting for them now, and they had to cover difficult terrain while carrying heavy equipment. But the team was experienced and well-trained. They knew how to move silently through hostile territory and avoid detection. Rodriguez established communication with their extraction team, confirming the successful completion of the mission and requesting immediate pickup at the predetermined location. The helicopter would be waiting for them, but first they had to reach the landing zone without being caught by the enemy patrols that were already searching the mountains. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of relief and adrenaline that came after a successful mission. The target was eliminated, her team was safe, and they were beginning their journey home. But she also knew that the hardest part might still be ahead of them. Getting out of enemy territory required different skills than taking a long-distance shot. The mountain paths were treacherous even in daylight, and they would soon be carrying full packs while trying to avoid enemy patrols. Every step had to be carefully considered, every sound minimized, every movement planned to avoid detection. The success of the mission meant nothing if they couldn't make it home safely. As they began moving toward their first checkpoint, Sarah reflected on the shot that had just made military history. The bullet had traveled for nearly 4 seconds across more than 2 miles of mountain air before finding its target. It was a feat of marksmanship that few people would ever believe possible, let alone achieve themselves. The team had been moving silently through the mountain paths for 2 hours when the world exploded around them. An improvised explosive device, hidden beneath loose rocks on the trail, detonated just as Rodriguez stepped on the pressure plate. The blast threw all 4 team members in different directions, their ears ringing from the thunderous explosion. Sarah found herself alone behind a large boulder, her head spinning and her vision blurry. Blood trickled down her face from cuts caused by flying rock fragments. Her rifle lay several feet away, partially buried under debris from the explosion. The silence after the blast was deafening, broken only by the ringing in her ears. She tried to call out to her teammates but heard no response. The explosion had been perfectly placed to cause maximum damage to anyone using that particular path. Enemy fighters had clearly prepared for the possibility that the sniper team would use this route during their escape. It was a carefully planned ambush. Slowly, Sarah crawled toward her rifle, ignoring the pain in her left shoulder where she had hit the rocks. Her training kicked in automatically. Secure your weapon, assess your injuries, locate your teammates, establish communications. Each step was crucial for survival in a hostile environment. The Barrett was damaged but still functional. The scope had been knocked loose, but Sarah could still use the iron sights if necessary. More importantly, she still had ammunition, and the rifle could fire. In her current situation, that weapon might be the difference between life and death. Sarah tried her radio, calling for her teammates using their code names. Static filled her earpiece, but she heard no responses. Either their radios were damaged, they were unconscious, or something worse had happened. The realization that she might be completely alone in enemy territory began to sink in. Moving carefully from boulder to boulder, Sarah searched for any sign of her teammates. The explosion had scattered equipment across a wide area, and she could see pieces of their gear among the rocks. But there was no movement, no sounds that would indicate anyone else had survived the blast. She found Chen first, lying motionless behind a fallen tree about 50 meters from the explosion site. His body was still, and Sarah could see that he had taken the full force of the blast. Her friend and spotter, the man who had helped her make the historic shot just hours earlier, was gone. The loss hit her like a physical blow. Rodriguez was found next, his communications equipment destroyed and his body broken by the impact with the rocks. The man who had kept them connected to their command and coordinated their extraction was another casualty of the carefully planned ambush. Sarah, felt anger building alongside her grief. Park, their security specialist, had been thrown the farthest by the blast. Sarah found her wedged between two rocks, unconscious but still breathing. For a moment, Sarah felt hope that at least one of her teammates had survived. But as she checked Park's condition, she realized the injuries were severe and beyond her ability to treat in the field. The sound of vehicles echoing across the mountains told Sarah that enemy forces were closing in on their position. The explosion had been a signal as much as a weapon, alerting nearby patrols to the location of the sniper team. She had very little time before they would be surrounded and captured or killed. Sarah faced an impossible choice. She could try to carry Park to safety, but her teammates' injuries were severe and the movement might kill her. Or she could leave Park behind and try to escape alone, knowing that capture would mean torture and death for her wounded friend. Neither option offered much hope of success. The vehicles were getting closer, and Sarah could hear voices calling out in the local language. Search teams were spreading out to comb the area for survivors of the explosion. Soon they would find the bodies of her teammates, and then they would find her hiding place among the rocks. With a heavy heart, Sarah made the hardest decision of her military career. She couldn't save Park, and staying would only result in both of their deaths or capture. She had to escape alone and try to reach the extraction point, hoping against hope that somehow her teammate might survive until rescue could arrive. Sarah gathered what equipment she could carry: her rifle, ammunition, water, and basic medical supplies. Everything else had to be left behind, including some of the most advanced communications and targeting equipment in the military arsenal. But survival trumped equipment recovery. Before leaving, Sarah used her emergency beacon to send a distress signal to their command center. The signal would alert them to the team's situation and provide their last known location. It might help a rescue team find Park, though Sarah knew the chances were slim. The voices were very close now, and Sarah could see armed men moving among the rocks where her teammates had fallen. She had to move immediately or risk being spotted. Every instinct told her to stay and fight, to avenge her fallen friends, but her training overrode emotion. Her mission now was survival and escape. Sarah began moving away from the explosion site, using every piece of cover the rocky terrain provided. Her shoulder throbbed with each movement, and her head still rang from the blast. But she forced herself to keep going. The enemy search teams were thorough and would eventually find her hiding spot. The mountain paths that had seemed challenging during their insertion now felt like death traps. Any step could trigger another explosive device, and enemy fighters knew the terrain far better than she did. Sarah had to rely on her training, her instincts, and a considerable amount of luck to have any chance of reaching safety. As she climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah could hear the search teams spreading out behind her. Voices echoed off the rocky walls as the enemy coordinated their hunt for the surviving sniper. They knew someone had escaped the explosion, and they were determined to find her before she could reach friendly territory. Sarah moved through the mountain terrain like a ghost, using every shadow and rock formation to stay hidden from the search teams below. The enemy had deployed dozens of fighters to hunt for her, and she could hear their voices echoing off the canyon walls as they coordinated their sweep of the area. They knew she was somewhere in these mountains, and they were determined to find her. Her shoulder burned with pain from the explosion, and dried blood covered half her face from the rock cuts. But Sarah pushed through the discomfort, drawing on reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. Every step took her farther from her dead teammates and closer to what she hoped would be safety. The enemy fighters were systematic in their search, checking every cave, every cluster of rocks, every possible hiding place. Sarah had to stay ahead of them while conserving her energy for what might be a days-long journey to the extraction point. Water was already running low, and she had no way to resupply. From her position on a high ridge, Sarah could see the search pattern below. The enemy had divided into teams of 4 or 5 men each, spreading out in a grid formation that covered every possible escape route. They were experienced hunters who knew these mountains intimately. She was the prey now, and they were closing. In Sarah's training in evasion and survival became her lifeline. She moved during daylight when she could see threats, rested in concealed positions during the hottest parts of the day, and used the terrain to mask her movement from observers below. Every decision was calculated to maximize her chances of staying undetected. The Barrett rifle was both an asset and a burden. At nearly 30 pounds, it slowed her movement and made climbing more difficult. But it was also her most effective weapon if she was discovered and had to fight her way out. The 50 caliber rounds could penetrate most cover the enemy might use for protection. Late in the afternoon, Sarah heard helicopters approaching from the south. Her heart leaped with hope that it might be a rescue mission. But the aircraft bore enemy markings. They were expanding the search to include aerial reconnaissance, making her situation even more desperate. Hiding from ground teams was difficult, enough without also avoiding aircraft. The helicopters flew in a search pattern, hovering near suspected hiding places and using loudspeakers to demand her surrender. Sarah pressed herself against a rock overhang as one aircraft passed directly overhead, so close she could see the faces of the crew looking down at the terrain below. As darkness approached, Sarah faced another critical decision. She could continue, moving at night when the helicopters couldn't operate effectively, but ground teams would be harder to spot in the darkness. Or she could find a defensive position and try to wait them out, hoping they would eventually give up the search. The sound of barking dogs changed everything. The enemy had brought in tracking animals that could follow her scent trail through the mountains. No amount of careful movement would help against dogs that could track her by smell. Sarah's situation had just become nearly impossible. She could hear the dogs getting excited as they picked up her trail from the explosion site. The handlers were experienced and knew how to use the animals effectively in mountainous terrain. Sarah estimated she had maybe an hour before the dogs would lead the search teams directly to her position. Sarah began moving faster, no longer worried about perfect concealment, but focused on putting distance between herself and the pursuing teams. She climbed higher into the mountains, hoping the thin air and rocky terrain might slow the dogs. But she knew they would eventually catch up. The first shots rang out just as the sun disappeared behind the western peaks. Sarah had been spotted by a forward patrol, and the fighters immediately opened fire with automatic weapons. She dove behind a cluster of rocks as bullets sparked off the stone surfaces around her. Sarah returned fire with the Barrett, the massive rifle booming across the valley. The 50 caliber rounds had devastating effect on the enemy position, forcing them to take cover and buy her precious time to move to a new location. But the muzzle flash had given away her position to every enemy team in the area. Radio chatter erupted as the patrol called in Sarah's location to their command center. Within minutes, she could see muzzle flashes from multiple positions as enemy teams converged on her area. The hunt had become a full-scale battle, with Sarah alone against dozens of determined fighters. She moved from position to position, using the Barrett to keep enemy teams at a distance while slowly working her way up the mountain. Each shot was carefully aimed to maximize effect and conserve ammunition. She couldn't afford to waste a single round in what was becoming a running gun battle. The enemy tactics were sound. Some teams provided covering fire while others moved to flank her position. They were trying to surround her and cut off any escape routes. Sarah had to stay mobile and unpredictable to avoid being trapped by their coordinated assault. Darkness provided some cover, but muzzle flashes from both sides lit up the mountainside like deadly fireworks. Sarah could see enemy fighters moving among the rocks below her, closing the trap she had to escape. The famous shot that morning seemed like it had happened in another lifetime. Her ammunition was running low, and exhaustion was beginning to affect her accuracy and decision-making. Sarah knew she couldn't sustain this level of combat much longer without help. The extraction point was still miles away, and dawn would bring renewed searching by helicopters and fresh ground teams. As she prepared to move to another position, Sarah allowed herself a moment to think about her fallen teammates. Chen, Rodriguez, and Park had died doing their duty, and now she was fighting to make sure their sacrifice meant something. The successful elimination of their target had been worth the risk, but the cost had been higher than anyone expected. Dawn brought no relief to Sarah's desperate situation. Enemy helicopters resumed their search at first light, and she could see fresh teams of fighters moving up the mountain paths toward her last known position. Her ammunition was down to her final magazine, and dehydration was beginning to affect her performance. From her hiding spot in a shallow cave, Sarah could count at least 40 enemy fighters spread across the mountainside below her. They had established a perimeter and were systematically searching every possible hiding place. The dogs had lost her scent during the night's gun battle, but it was only a matter of time before they picked it up again. Sarah's emergency beacon showed her position relative to the extraction point. She was still 8 kilometers away across some of the most difficult terrain in the mountains. Even without being hunted by enemy forces, it would be a challenging journey for a fully equipped team. For one wounded soldier with limited supplies, it seemed impossible. The radio in her pack crackled to life with an encrypted message from command. A rescue helicopter was en route to her location, but it couldn't land in the area where she was currently trapped. Sarah had to break through the enemy perimeter and reach a clearing another 2 kilometers up the mountain. She had less than 2 hours to make it happen. Sarah studied the terrain between her position and the extraction point. The path would take her directly through the heart of the enemy search area. She would have to move in broad daylight, crossing open ground where she could be spotted by both ground teams and aircraft. The odds of success were minimal, but it was her only chance. She began moving during a lull in the helicopter patrols, using a dry riverbed that provided some concealment from aerial observation. The Barrett rifle felt heavier with each step, but she couldn't abandon her primary weapon. If she was spotted, the rifle's long-range capability might be her only advantage against multiple enemy teams. The sound of voices speaking the local language told Sarah she was approaching an enemy position. She crawled to the edge of a rock formation and saw 4 fighters positioned to watch one of the main paths up the mountain. They were alert and well-armed, making it impossible to slip past undetected. Sarah had 3 rounds left in her rifle and 1 full pistol magazine. She had to make every shot count if she hoped to break through to the extraction point. The Barrett's scope was still damaged from the explosion, but she could use the iron sights effectively at shorter ranges. The first shot took down the enemy fighter who posed the greatest threat, the one with the radio who could call for reinforcements. The massive .50 caliber bullet eliminated him instantly, but the sound of the shot alerted every enemy team in the area to her exact location. The final battle had begun. Sarah moved immediately after firing, knowing the enemy would target her, muzzle flash. Bullets sparked off the rocks where she had been positioned just seconds before. She had given up stealth for speed, racing toward the extraction point while enemy teams converged on her position from all directions. The second shot disabled a machine gun team that was setting up to block her path. The third and final rifle round took out a sniper who was trying to line up a shot from a parallel ridge. With her rifle empty, Sarah discarded the heavy weapon and drew her sidearm, continuing her desperate dash toward safety. Enemy fighters appeared on both sides of her path, forcing Sarah to weave between boulders and use every scrap of cover available. Her pistol cracked repeatedly as she engaged targets at close range, buying precious seconds to keep moving toward the extraction point. The sound of rotors echoing off the mountain walls announced the arrival of the rescue helicopter. Sarah could see the aircraft approaching the clearing ahead, but she still had to cover the final 500 meters while under fire from multiple directions. The helicopter crew would wait as long as possible, but they couldn't risk being shot down. Sarah's pistol ran dry just as she reached the edge of the clearing. Enemy fighters were closing in from behind, and she had no ammunition left to stop them. She ran across the open ground toward the helicopter as bullets cut through the air around her, knowing this was her last chance for survival. The helicopter crew provided covering fire as Sarah sprinted toward the aircraft. Their door gunner engaged enemy positions, buying her the precious seconds needed to reach safety. She dove through the open door just as the helicopter lifted off, enemy bullets striking the aircraft's armored hull. As the helicopter banked away from the mountain, Sarah looked back at the battlefield where her teammates had died and where she had fought against impossible odds. The mission had been successful. Their target was eliminated and she had survived to tell the story. But the cost had been higher than anyone could have imagined. The historic 3,200-meter shot that Sarah had made seemed like ancient history now. Military experts would study and discuss that shot for years to come. But Sarah knew the real story was about the teammates who had made it possible and paid the ultimate price for success. During the flight back to base, Sarah reflected on the events of the past day. She had made military history with her marksmanship, survived an ambush that killed her entire team, and fought her way through enemy territory against overwhelming odds. But all she could think about were Chen, Rodriguez, and Park, the friends, who had started the mission with her but would never make it home. The helicopter carrying Sarah back to safety flew over the same mountains where her historic shot had been taken. Below, enemy forces were still searching for the sniper who had eliminated their leader and escaped their trap. They would never know how close they had come to capturing one of the military's most skilled marksmen. Sarah's story would become legend in military circles. The sniper who made an impossible shot and then survived alone against an entire enemy force. But for Sarah herself, the mission would always be remembered as the day she lost her best friends and learned the true cost of war. The 3,200-meter shot had made history, but the price of that history would stay with her forever.